Hello guys, welcome back to LR Anime. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of Soul Land 2 episode number 137 based on novel. So let's start. Wangyang Fong realized what was going on at the critical moment and shouted without any hesitation, "I concede defeat." A streak of dazzling silver light fell from the sky and engulfed his body. More than a quarter of his side of the stage was turned to dust and collapsed completely. The protective barriers on this side of the stage surged with blinding light. The more than 20 soul engineers who were maintaining the protective barrier all spat blood at the same time. A pair of bronze palm prints were still present on the ground that had caved in. The area that was struck was completely smooth and appeared worked by someone with splendid carving skills. Only 2 spots within this area hadn't caved in. Wangyang Fong was in one of the spots, while Zheng Zhon, who had used his silver-colored protective barrier to protect Wangyang Fong, was in the other spot. Zheng Zhon's arms were still shaking gently. He was horrified, but it wasn't obvious. As a titled Doluor, he should have been able to easily restrain a soul emperor. However, those palms made him finally understand why the body sect was so strong. Zheng Zhon knew that it would be impossible for him to unleash such a strong palm strike without any soul tools even if he had 8 rings. Even soul masters who specialized in cultivating martial souls might not be so terrifying when they unleashed their martial soul true body with 7 rings. This was the strength of a body soul. However, Wangyang Fong had still lost. Huo Yuhao was seated in his wheelchair in the air. He slowly landed with the Snow Lady's help. He seemed very relaxed, and didn't even pull out his milk bottle. Wangyang Fong hadn't seen what had happened, but Zheng Zhon had witnessed everything clearly. Huo Yuhao had only taken his milk bottle out earlier. He didn't suck any soul power from the bottle. He had not been far from Huo Yuhao earlier, as he had been preparing to save the crippled young man. Huo Yuhao's milk bottle had unleashed a light that made it look like soul power was being absorbed from it. However, there weren't any soul power undulations from that light. Was it a smokescreen or illusion? At this point, Wangyang Fong still couldn't believe that he had lost. However, he knew that he couldn't have blocked his own attack. He would have been critically injured even if he didn't die. There wasn't any way he could compete in the team round after this. As an elite from the younger generation of body sect disciples, he had actually lost to a soul king. It was even a soul king who was crippled. He was even more embarrassed that his opponent was from Shrek Academy. It was important to know that the body sect and Shrek Academy had many disputes with one another. Embarrassing. It was too embarrassing. Wangyang Fong lowered his head in shame. He quickly rushed off the stage, and didn't even say anything. Huo Yuhao wore a smile as he sat back in his wheelchair. The light from his milk bottle appeared once again. This time, he was really sucking the soul power from the milk bottle to restore his own soul power. He didn't just win this physical fight. More importantly, he achieved a psychological and tactical victory. He had wanted to give his opponents the impression that he was willing to fight until the end against them. Both parties had clashed a few times with one another, and Wangyang Fong couldn't help but feel that Huo Yuhao was really strong. The rest of the changes were all within Huo Yuhao's calculations. He used his imitation to tempt his opponent into unleashing an all-out attack. It was also his first time using the 5th soul skill of his spirit eyes, spiritual duplication. It was the strong soul skill that he obtained when he was in the Great Star Do Forest with Wang Chua. It was obvious what soul skill he had duplicated from the effects of it. It was Shu Sanchi's mysterious underworld displacement. This divine skill from a defense-type soul master achieved the same divine effects even when he used it. No matter how well the Snow Demon sect knew him, they couldn't have guessed he had such a skill. Wangyang Fong was the one who bore the consequences of his own attack. In fact, Wangyang Fong had a wealth of live experience. It was a pity that he wasn't cunning enough to best Huo Yuhao. Bound to his wheelchair, Huo Yuhao was too deceptive. His greatest advantage wasn't any overwhelming ability, but the complexity of the types of abilities he possessed. He could use a myriad of fighting strategies against his opponent. Only Wang Donga truly understood everything when she finished watching this fight. Only she understood that the core of Huo Yuhao's abilities came from his spirit eyes, even though he had used so many soul skills. All his planning had revolved around his spirit eyes. Tang sect versus the Snow Demon sect. The Tang sect wins the first individual elimination round. Zheng Zhon announced the result, watching Huo Yuhao carefully. Huo Yuhao gave him a very weird feeling. Down in the waiting area, Wei En's astonishment slowly faded away. She nodded slightly, and her eyes flashed. She whispered a few words to her teammates before another young man jumped onto the stage. He quickly walked out to the center. As this was an individual elimination round, the stage couldn't be repaired, as that would give the victorious soul master the time needed to restore his soul power and energy. The tournament could only continue. At most, some simple repairs could be made before the team round. Both parties, please report your names. Tang sect, Huo Yuhao. Snow Demon sect, Chenlu. The members of the Snow Demon sect were all glaring at Hua Yuhao, as if they were trying to figure out something about him. Hua Yuhao appeared as leisurely as ever, as if nothing had happened at all. His aura also hadn't changed because of the previous fight. Both parties quickly retreated to their respective sides of the stage. Hua Yuhao was still holding his milk bottle in his hand, and seemed to have no intention of putting it away. However, he didn't delay the fight either. He pressed 3 of the fingers of his right hand against his milk bottle before turning his wheelchair around. It was a pretty sad sight. The spectators weren't too hostile either, since the Sun Moon team had already been eliminated. They pitied him a little as they saw him in this state. Hua Yuhao turned around as he reached his side of the stage. Only he knew that the previous victory hadn't come easily. Wangyang Fong was indeed very strong. The Soul Emperors of the Body Sect weren't inferior to Soul Emperors like Ma Xiaodao from Shrek. Even when Hua Yuhao was in his normal condition, he still had to give his all in order to beat such an opponent with his cultivation as a Soul King. Moreover, he was in a very deprived state right now. His greatest advantage was that his opponents didn't know him well. They also didn't know about the enhancement to his spiritual power that he had received after he went to the Icefire Yin-Yang well and ended up in his current disabled state. Indeed, his spirit eyes were the core of all his fighting strategies. "Begin," the unbreakable Doluor shouted, announcing the start of the second individual elimination round. Chenlu crouched down before jumping forward. He was very quick, like an arrow loosed from a bow. He stuck close to the ground as he raced towards Hua Yuhao. Everyone was impressed by his speed. His speed was different from Wang Qiu's speed, which was generated from her explosive power. His speed came from his extremely great leaping abilities. When he came up onto the stage, Hua Yuhao had immediately realized his legs were different from those of normal people. They were more muscular and developed. His calves were so thick that they were almost the size of a regular person's thighs. As he leapt forward, he immediately demonstrated his shocking springing ability. He was in front of Hua Yuhao almost instantly. Sliding tackle. Against the immobile Hua Yuhao, Chenlu chose an offensive method that was difficult to anticipate. Just as he was about to reach Hua Yuhao, he leaned back and kicked forward with his legs, one high and one low as he slid in. He wasn't targeting Hua Yuhao, but his wheelchair. It was a brilliant tactic. Zheng Zhon's eyes brightened. Even though Chenlu's attack was a little despicable, Zheng Zhon had to admit that it was effective. If Hua Yuhao were without his wheelchair, it would be equivalent to him losing his legs. He already found it very difficult to move. Without his wheelchair, his fighting strength would fall considerably. Even though Chenlu had 5 soul rings just like Hua Yuhao, he seemed to have found the key to victory the moment he entered the fray. Everyone believed that Hua Yuhao had to stop his opponent's sliding tackle right now. Otherwise, he would lose his only form of mobility if his wheelchair was damaged. There wasn't going to be any way for him to face his opponent then. Even those from the Tang sect couldn't help but become anxious when they saw this. What method was Hua Yuhao going to use to deal with his opponent? Hua Yuhao didn't move. It seemed like he had no intention of stopping his opponent. Chenlu was very quick, and was about to strike the wheelchair. Even Chenlu was surprised when Hua Yuhao didn't bother to stop him. He was already prepared. If Hua Yuhao tried to stop him, he would unleash all his strength and destroy the wheelchair no matter the price. Once he did that, victory was almost certain. Just as Chenlu was slightly uncertain, Hua Yuhao finally acted. He slapped the side of his chair using his right hand, and his wheelchair flew into the air. At the same time, his wheelchair slid diagonally to one side. If he was just purely dodging Chenlu's attack, Chenlu was already prepared to deal with it. However, Hua Yuhao and his wheelchair seemed to fuse with the air as they dodged. They disappeared without a sound. Concealment. Chenlu was shocked. He even forgot to retract his power, and only reacted after sliding more than 10 meters. He pointed his toes to the ground before leaping up again. However, he couldn't trace Hua Yuhao after he turned around. All the spectators were stunned when they saw this. Hua Yuhao is even able to conceal himself. In the Snow Demon sect's waiting area, Wei Ena focused even more intently on the fight going on. She realized that Hua Yuhao wasn't just a difficult character to deal with in terms of business negotiations. Even with only his right hand, he was still very strong. Hua Yuhao was naturally using his evolved million-year soul skill, imitation. In fact, he had no choice. Once his opponent moved, he could tell that Chenlu's main strength was his speed. At the same time, his own greatest flaw was his current lack of agility. Hua Yuhao had used his spiritual shock earlier, and knew his opponent would exercise caution against it. Moreover, he didn't want to overuse his spiritual shock, which was his strongest killer move. The more he used an ability, the easier it was for his opponent to find flaws in it. That was why he used his imitation to conceal his figure and disappear in the air. As long as he didn't shift too much, it would be very difficult for his opponent to determine his position from the ripples in the air. Through his spiritual detection, Hua Yuhao also discovered that Chenlu's martial soul was his calves. One's calves were points of exertion for one's strength. From this, he could tell that Chenlu was very strong in terms of speed and explosive power. After pausing for a moment to assess the situation, Chenlu immediately reacted. He quickly turned around. His third soul ring shone brightly, and he immediately sprang into the air. His legs intersected in the air as he kicked out. Instantly, he created several illusory projections of his legs in the air. Every projection carried a streak of dark green light, and a piercing sound reverberated in the air. In a flash, countless projections appeared in the air and filled the stage. Without a doubt, Chenlu was using a high-frequency area attack to determine Hua Yuhao's position. His spiritual power wasn't weak, since he hailed from the body sect. As he focused to sense Hua Yuhao's position, he would immediately capture Hua Yuhao's position once there were any strong soul power undulations. Indeed, a streak of dark golden-green light caused a ring to ripple before Hua Yuhao's wheelchair appeared once again. He had used his right hand to block the kick blade, but seemed a little pathetic as he did so. Chenlu snorted and quickly jumped up again. His third soul ring was still shining, and his legs intersected as they kicked out at the same time as he charged towards Hua Yuhao. Streaks and streaks of dark green projections engulfed him. Amid the piercing whistles, the light blades were all aimed towards Hua Yuhao. However, it was at this moment that something weird appeared. Hua Yuhao suddenly rose several meters into the air and avoided the blades with an unbelievably deft movement. At the same time, he made a turn in the air which seemed to completely violate the laws of physics. He charged towards Chenlu. Chenlu was stunned at this moment. Even a soul master with wings couldn't have made such a dodging action in the air. It involved countless swaying movements mid-air. Is his disability fake? Otherwise, how did he manage to dodge everything so quickly in mid-air? Chenlu couldn't be bothered by anything else, too horrified by this action. He quickly shut his legs, and a beam of intense bronze light shone behind his back. Just like Hua Yuhao had predicted, his body soul was his calves. In addition, his second awakening was a bronze-ranked one. Instantly, Chenlu's whole body grew by more than a meter. His calves also became extremely thick, tearing his pants open. His legs intersected as he kicked out. Amid the terrifying bronze light, his calves were like two huge awls unleashed against Hua Yuhao. As his calves swept through the air, it felt as if the air had been torn apart. Hua Yuhao's speed fell drastically. Chenlu was still living in the shadow of Wangyang Fong's defeat. Right now, Hua Yuhao was demonstrating some very weird abilities. He had to give his all at this point. The second awakening of his body soul was indeed frightening. His body soul became very strong, and covered a domain that no ordinary soul masters could compare to. Even a soul emperor couldn't achieve a fighting strength like him. Something that left Chenlu shocked happened again. In his opinion, the only way Hua Yuhao could avoid his attack was by resisting it directly. It was impossible to dodge. After learning from Wangyang Fong's mistakes, he didn't force his soul power out of his body. He gathered the strength of the second awakening in his calves. In this way, he wouldn't be affected even if Hua Yuhao switched places with him. However, something weirder than what had happened to Wangyang Fong occurred. Hua Yuhao and his wheelchair broke just as Chenlu's calves struck him. Yes, they broke. Countless streaks of bloody light burst out, and the broken wheelchair scattered in all directions. Everyone exclaimed and jumped up in shock at this scene. Chenlu was in a daze. However, he also discovered that something was wrong at the same time. That was because he didn't feel as if he had contacted anything when he struck Hua Yuhao. A deep blue sword light that seemed as if it wanted to tear the nine heavens apart silently appeared not far away behind Chenlu. That deep blue sword light was shiny and transparent. It was so clear that it seemed like it was formed with a water crystal. Wherever it passed, it formed a deep blue light screen. It appeared just at the moment when Chenlu finished his previous attack and had yet to unleash his next attack. The timing was perfect. Unparalleled chill, Empress Sword. This time, Hua Yuhao was the one holding the Empress Sword. The Snow Lady had disappeared. Chenlu's eyes shone with light. In the face of such a crisis, he didn't panic at all. Among the younger generation disciples of the body sect, he was one of the best. Even though his cultivation was inferior to Wangyang Fong's, he was only still 18 years old. In terms of talent, he might even be better than Wangyang Fong. Wangyang Fong lost at the hands of his own attack, but Chenlu was even more cautious after the loss. After realizing something was amiss, he didn't even turn around to look. He immediately activated his fifth soul ring. A pitch-black soul ring shone brightly, and Chenlu did a half-crouch. Behind him, a third leg silently extended out. This leg was also covered in a greenish-bronze glow, and looked identical to his own legs. The three legs bent at the same. As a low-pitched roar sounded, Chenlu seemed to have overcompressed the air beneath him, causing an explosion to spread out. He released a projection from his body after this. The bronze light engulfed his entire body. The weird thing was that the bronze projection revealed the form of a mutant with a dragon's head and a frog's body. Just as he completed this, The unparalleled chill ferociously slashed his body. Dang! It sounded like an awl had struck a huge bell. There was a tremendous echo across the entire arena. It even shook the stage slightly. Chenlu was smashed down to the ground by the sword, and his body sank a foot into the floor. The mutated projection that was supposed to protect him was also covered with a deep blue layer of light. It froze instantly. The spectators were bamboozled by this series of changes. There were very few who could tell what was actually happening. Undoubtedly, Chenlu was suffering. However, why was he at a disadvantage? What did Hu Yuhao do to him? Very few people understood the sequence of events. Only those who were very keen could guess that Hu Yuhao was using an illusion. In the Snow Demon sect's waiting area, all their team members looked very serious now. Right now, they had just realized that Hu Yuhao was able to pose a huge threat to them. His abilities seemed to be endless. He used the ultimate ice, illusions, summoning, and even soul tools. How was a soul master able to possess all these skills? Even though Wei Na and Mu Shui knew Hu Yuhao, they didn't know much about him. Even after investigating his background, they only knew that he had twin martial souls, one spiritual type and the other ultimate ice type. In addition, he had turned the tables in the previous tournament. However, all this had been accomplished when his body was in its normal condition. Right now, only his right hand could move. Even though he had twin martial souls, how many of his abilities could he unleash? They were bound to be greatly weakened. However, they understood some things after watching the first two fights. Even when Hu Yuhao had problems moving, his fighting strength couldn't be underestimated. He was not inferior to a Soul Emperor even when handicapped. The most frightening thing was how mysterious his fighting strategies were. Wangyang Fong lost so ridiculously, and Chenlu was also losing right now. After the flying-type soul tools on his shoulders raised Hu Yuhao into the air, they shot out light that propelled his wheelchair towards Chenlu. Hu Yuhao raised his right hand, and his dark golden terror claws appeared. As someone who possessed the ultimate ice, he was well aware that his opponent's power depletion from that attack wasn't very great even though he had used all his strength. Chenlu used his fifth soul skill at the critical moment, which greatly resisted his attack. It was Chenlu's mutant projection that was frozen, and not Chenlu himself. He was only delayed right now because he was still affected by the chill brought about by the ultimate ice. Hu Yuhao thought privately that if he were in his peak state, he would be able to completely suppress his five-ringed opponent, even if his opponent was from the body sect. He might even be able to crush him. Facing what he was now, he could completely rely on his ice explosion to continue harming his opponent. At the same time, his speed wouldn't be so slow, were it not for his body condition. There was a loud crunch, and a huge crack appeared in the ice. It looked like Chenlu was about to break out from the ice. Hu Yuhao's expression turned serious, and he swiped his right hand. The complete version of the dark golden terror claws was unleashed. No one could compare to him in terms of capturing the perfect timing. Just as the dark golden lights from his terror claws arrived, the ice broke apart, and Chenlu escaped. Chenlu was instantly greeted with the extremely sharp blades. Chenlu had no other choice. His fifth soul ring lit up. He used his fifth soul skill once again, the three-legged dragon toad. He had obtained this soul skill after hunting and killing a 10,000-year three-legged dragon toad. When he used this soul skill, he could create another leg for his body soul. As he released a light barrier from his three-legged dragon toad, he could protect himself and greatly increase his fighting strength. Among the same generation disciples of the body sect, his fifth soul ring was the best among all the soul rings at the same level. He was recognized to have the strongest fifth soul ring in the entire body sect. Gaining 5 rings and attaining this ability before he was 18 years old was why he could represent the body sect in this tournament. At the same time, he was being nurtured as one of the future elites of the sect. Chenlu, who wanted to get up and slammed, was smacked back to the ground. Although his three-legged dragon toad blocked the attack of the dark golden terror claws, the terror claws were still the dark golden terror claw bear's greatest ability. It was extremely destructive, and wasn't inferior to Hu Yuhao's strongest version of the unparalleled chill. 5 enormous cracks appeared on the barrier, and the effect of the 10,000-year soul skill was instantly destroyed. Chenlu was so devastated that he almost spat blood. Hu Yuhao had no intention of letting him off. He retracted his terror claws and clenched his fist. A bright golden light extended from his body. Following this, he punched out at Chenlu. Sovereign's Descent. This was the Sovereign's Descent formed after Hu Yuhao fused his spiritual power and various abilities together. He had already evolved the Dragon God Doluor's skill into his own version. Chenlu cursed in his heart, and a layer of golden light was released from his body. He had already used his three-legged dragon toad twice, and it wasn't feasible for him to use it a third time. As his soul power rapidly dipped, he had no choice but to activate his own invincible barrier. Ripples formed on the barrier as the blow slammed against it, but it gave Chenlu an opportunity to catch his breath. He quickly channeled power into his legs and sprang up from the depression he was in. With how strong his legs were, he immediately flew high into the sky. Chenlu was clearly aware of his greatest strength, which was his speed. However, he had been completely suppressed by Hua Yuhao during their confrontations. His speed advantage couldn't be realized. After using his fifth soul skill twice and initiating the second awakening of his body soul, he had already used up more power than Wangyang Fong had earlier. Time wasn't on his side. Chenlu hated Hua Yuhao a lot right now. It was his first fight in the entire tournament. His teammates and Princess Wei Yana were watching him. How could he lose to a cripple? He flipped around in the air, and his energy flow smoothed out. Although he was affected by the chill from the ultimate ice, he managed to repress this chill using his cultivation. He took a deep breath, and seemed to grow larger. His legs expanded, and the greenish-bronze projection flashed behind his back again. This time, Chenlu had completely locked onto Hua Yuhao. Having jumped high into the air, he came swiftly crashing back down. He couldn't differentiate between Hua Yuhao's illusions, so he wanted to use his speed so that Hua Yuhao didn't have any opportunity to use his illusory tricks. This time, Hua Yuhao couldn't dodge the incessant attacks anymore. He looked up at his opponent in the sky and raised his right arm to block his body. A ring of distorted ripples was released from an ordinary-looking ring on one of his right-hand fingers. This ring of ripples changed into a gentle, milky white shield that protected him. Subtle golden patterns appeared on the shield. In order to prevent himself from being displaced, Chenlu came down with only his physical body. His legs, which were now more than 2 meters long, appeared deformed. It was as if 2 bronze pillars were descending from the sky and crashing down. When the 2 bronze pillars struck Hua Yuhao's shield, there was a massive boom as a ball of greenish-bronze light surged and blew apart, with Hua Yuhao at the center of the explosion. It felt as if a huge hammer had fallen from the sky and pounded the stage. The surrounding floor collapsed, and a terrifying destructive force caused countless fissures to extend across the stage floor. A figure shot back into the sky, and a bronze light started to undulate tremendously. As his screams echoed out, the figure that shot into the sky spat out fresh blood. As the bronze light dispersed, it became clear that the figure belonged to Chenlu. The tremendous explosion caused debris to fly everywhere. As Chenlu was driven back, Hua Yuhao's figure also became clear amid the debris. Rings of white surrounded his body and made it seem as if he were in a fairy tale. Layers and layers of glowing light undulated around his shield, as if they were shaking. Beneath him, there was an area 1.5 meters in diameter that hadn't collapsed at all. He managed to block Chenlu's all-out attack. Chenlu crashed down. When he landed on the ground, his calves had already returned to normal. However, he fell on his butt and grabbed his legs with both his hands while screaming in pain. Right now, it was very clear that his calves were in very unnatural shapes. Evidently, he was gravely injured. Hua Yuhao shut his eyes and sensed the surging life aura in his body. Through his spiritual force, he asked in some concern, "Brother Skydream, how are you?" He had used the life-reflecting shield to resist Chenlu's attack. It was the strength the Skydream Iceworm had conferred onto Hua Yuhao after he turned into a spirit. Even though the Skydream Iceworm didn't have 4 orange-gold soul rings like the Snow Empress, he was still a million-year soul beast. Although his blood couldn't compare to the Snow Empress, he was still the only soul beast in the continent to reach a million-year cultivation. The greatest strength of the life-reflecting shield was that it could reflect an attack after absorbing the impact of an attack. Once the attack was reflected onto the opponent, the harm that was inflicted on the opponent would be equivalent to the strength fed to Skydream Iceworm's body to restore the defensive strength of the shield. In the close combat that had just occurred, Chenlu's all-out attack on the life-reflecting shield was fed back into his calves. How could he not be seriously injured? However, the Skydream Iceworm didn't have it easy against this attack either. He had indeed absorbed a huge amount of life power to replenish his own body, but he had also absorbed the entire impact of the attack, as he didn't have Hua Yuhao's soul power to support him. As a result, he bore the entire attack, which was stronger than an attack from a 7-ringed soul sage using his martial soul true body, all on his own. "I'm fine. The life power is very concentrated. However, I'll need some time to absorb it. At least, within 15 minutes, I'm unable to help you resist an attack of such a level again. Deal with it yourself." After hearing the Skydream Iceworm's words, Hua Yuhao heaved a sigh of relief. He couldn't use his own soul power to increase the defensive strength of the life-reflecting shield. However, he had to conserve his energy in the individual elimination round. He could only exploit the Skydream Iceworm's strength. With Chenlu's cultivation, it was impossible for him to truly damage the life-reflecting shield. The Skydream Iceworm only needing 15 minutes to recover was already beyond Hua Yuhao's expectations. As lights shot out above his shoulders, Hua Yuhao was propelled over the depression. The unbreakable Doluor was already in front of Chenlu. After checking out his condition, he immediately gestured to signal the end of the fight. Second individual elimination round. Hua Yuhao from the Tang sect wins. Everyone from the Snowdemon sect went silent in the waiting area. Wangyang Fong jumped onto the stage and carried the critically injured Chenlu down. After a brief inspection, he discovered that Chenlu's calves had broken into 3 parts. It wasn't just an injury to his physical body, it was also an injury to his martial soul. He was highly unlikely to be able to compete in the team round. Fortunately, Chenlu wasn't weak, and his calves were quite strong. Although they were fractured, his passageways weren't seriously hurt. After his teammates helped set his broken bones, he was in much less pain. Wei Na personally used her Snow Lotus to help him recover. Even if he couldn't compete today, he could still recover within a week under her treatment, based on his control of his martial soul. Chenlu's injury wasn't a big deal. However, what were they going to do in the following fights? Hu Yuhao had already won 2 fights. The Soul Emperors from the Tang sect had yet to compete. If this continued, the Snow Demon sect was going to be in an extremely disadvantageous situation. Wei Na furrowed her brow. At this point, a cold-looking young man stood from the Snow Demon sect stood up and said, "Let me go." Wei Na was stunned. As her gaze met his, the young man nodded at her. His body flashed, and he was already up on the stage. When Zheng Zhon announced Hu Yuhao's victory, Hu Yuhao was already making use of the time to restore his soul power. However, he felt his hair rising when this young man from the Snow Demon sect appeared on the stage. It gave him the same feeling as the time when the Sky Dream Iceworm met the Ice Empress in the extreme north. A soul master who was at most 20 years old actually gave him this sense of oppression, as if he were being watched by a savage beast. Evidently this young man's cultivation was quite high. Hu Yuhao focused his gaze and circulated his spiritual power to dispel that sense of oppression as he stared back at his opponent. This young man from the Snow Demon sect was tall and burly. All of his muscles were well-defined and toned. He stood almost 2 meters tall, and his shoulders were quite broad. His hair was split between half brown and half red, both sides of which appeared very soft. His eyes were narrow and long, and contained a cold, indifferent look. His nose was straight. Although he wasn't especially attractive, he was still slightly charming. Oddly, his skin was white, smooth, and glowed. When he raised his hands, his skin appeared very delicate. A strong opponent. Hu Yuhao immediately had this thought. He had the feeling that this guy was probably the strongest opponent he'd faced in the tournament thus far. He might not even be able to beat him if he was in peak condition, had the body sect finally sent their team leader up after losing 2 consecutive fights. The young man didn't rush to the center of the stage like the others had to reduce the time Hu Yuhao had to restore his soul power. Instead, he slowly approached Hu Yuhao. However, every step that he took increased the sense of oppression that he gave off. His aura also gradually started to grow. Hu Yuhao's expression changed slightly. With his acute senses, he was able to immediately sense how frightening his opponent was. His opponent's soul and spiritual power had reached a natural and seamless stage of fusion that was superior to even his own. Hu Yuhao's spiritual power was still greater than this young man's, but his soul power was weaker. When he fused them together, there were naturally some inequalities. Contrary to this, the feeling that his opponent gave him was one where his soul power and spiritual power couldn't be differentiated anymore, they seemed to be a single entity. Hu Yuhao had only experienced something like this from Elder Mu. Elder Mu had once told him that anyone who managed to do something like this had the potential to become a transcendent Doluor. If not, one's limit would be becoming a titled Doluor, no matter how great his talent and martial soul were. Taking a deep breath, Hu Yuhao calmed himself down. He looked at his opponent with a burning gaze and revealed a dim layer of golden light in his eyes. Soon afterwards, this layer of light quickly covered his entire body. A pure undulation comprised of his spiritual power surged towards his opponent. "I might be inferior to you in terms of my fusion of soul and spiritual power, therefore I'll use my superior spiritual power to clash against you." He couldn't lose to his opponent in terms of his aura. The tall and burly young man revealed a shocked expression. He stopped in his tracks momentarily, before continuing to walk towards Hu Yuhao. Zheng Zhon didn't stop them from staring at each other. Rather, he was astonished. He could clearly tell that these 2 young men in front of him had surpassed him in certain realms, despite their inferior cultivations. Was this the standard that most outstanding soul masters of the younger generation could achieve? Zheng Zhon was certain that they'd surpass him in the future so long as they were given sufficient time to mature and improve further. When the burly young man reached Hu Yuhao, their clashing auras peaked. Even Hu Yuhao's wheelchair revealed a dim golden glow. Hu Yuhao seemed a little pale. His eyes had turned almost pure gold at this point, and even his hair had been dyed golden. However, his opponent still seemed as calm as ever. Back in the waiting area, everyone from the Tang sect was shocked. They all knew Hu Yuhao very well. Based on the situation on stage, it seemed like Hu Yuhao was at a disadvantage despite not being suppressed by his opponent's aura. This burly young man must be quite strong. "Both parties, please give your names," Zheng Zhon said. Tang sect, Hu Yuhao. They were only a simple few words, but Hua Yuhao struggled to simply mutter them. The pressure bearing down on him was simply too great. Snow Demon Sect, Long Aotian. The young man said. Both parties, please step back and prepare for the start of the fight. Long Aotian nodded at Hua Yuhao, not attempting to hide the admiration in his eyes in the slightest. He then turned around and walked to his spot. Even though the stage had been heavily damaged, he didn't seem to care or notice. As he crossed the fissures that littered the ground, there seemed to be an aura around him that carried his body over them. He crossed them like they weren't even there. When he turned around again, the aura and sense of oppression that he'd been directing towards Hua Yuhao disappeared. Hua Yuhao's spiritual power surged forward, but seemed to find nothing. His opponent was obviously right in front of him, yet his spiritual power had completely lost its target. Hua Yuhao groaned, and a hint of red surfaced on his face. However, he stopped himself from spitting out the fresh blood that had filled his throat. Strong. Hua Yuhao was sure that he'd met the greatest opponent in his life thus far. The body sect deserved to be known as the most mysterious and powerful sect in the continent. Long Aotian's cultivation was on another level compared to his own. He had to be the team leader of the body sect. Hua Yuhao took a deep breath to calm the surging blood and energy in his body. After a moment, he slowly pushed his wheelchair towards his own spot. Back in the waiting area, Wang Donga looked at Bei Bei anxiously. Bei Bei shook his head at her and said, "Don't worry, he knows his limits. We have to trust him. This Long Aotian is going to be a tough nut to crack. Sancha, you should start preparing." "Yes." Shu Sancha looked at him. After years of brotherhood, he immediately understood what Bei Bei meant by the look in his eyes. Hua Yuhao retreated to his side of the stage and turned his wheelchair around. He grabbed the handle with his right hand and pulled himself up even straighter. Long Aotian was facing him again, but the aura from his body wasn't nearly as strong as before. Despite this, he seemed to have fused with the stage where he stood. Unity of heaven and man. Had his cultivation reached such a level? Hua Yuhao's eyes lit up. This was the level that he was pursuing. It wasn't just him. In the resting area, Ji Juechen's eyes also brightened. Both he and Hua Yuhao had very high goals when it came to their fighting techniques. No one else could compare to them in this aspect. It was also because of this that they were more intrigued when they saw Long Aotian's current condition. Zheng Zhon gestured as he shouted, "Begin." Hua Yuhao quickly lifted his head. Instantly, his eyes brightened and 5 soul rings surged upwards from his body. Following this, 2 streaks of purplish gold light shot out of his eyes towards his opponent. He wasn't going to hold back anymore. After winning 2 consecutive fights, his soul and spiritual power had been greatly depleted. This third round would be a huge test for him. Hua Yuhao's first soul ring shone brightly, a hint of white hidden amidst the glow. Now that he'd increased his spiritual power to its limit, his imitation wasn't able to conceal the true color of his soul rings anymore. 2 streaks of purplish gold light swept through the air and instantly reached Long Aotian. Long Aotian didn't move from his position and made a weird gesture in front of his chest. He raised his right palm towards the left and curled his fingers. He then raised his left palm towards the front with his fingers straightened. As he did this, he released a shiny glow from his body. Surrounded by the glow, he seemed to have become a jade sculpture. When Hua Yuhao's spiritual shock arrived, Long Aotian's sculpted body lit up with a blinding purplish gold light. Following this, it disappeared. His body swayed a little, followed by the shiny glow on his body dispersing. On the other side, Hua Yuhao let out a muffled groan, and he seemed very grim. He hadn't gained any advantage from this attack. However, he was slightly excited by how Long Aotian had resisted his attack. He could sense that Long Aotian had fused his spiritual and soul power with his entire body and then fused it with the heaven and earth to resist his attack. Such an experience and sensation were very enlightening to Hua Yuhao. This was the realm that he'd been searching for. This was the direction that he'd been working towards after he entered the concrete immaterial realm. If he could achieve a breakthrough and enable his spiritual and soul power to fuse with his body, his cultivation, physical strength, and control could rise to yet another level. Such a live experience was incredibly valuable for him. At the same time, his opponent's strength was also stimulating Hua Yuhao's own potential. Long Aotian was stunned after resisting this attack. He gently pressed his feet against the ground, and seemed to slide across the ground towards Hua Yuhao. Soul rings started to rise from beneath his feet. Yellow, purple, purple, black, 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 black. 7 soul rings of the best combination, out of which 4 were 10,000-year soul rings. This number had only been achieved by Wang Donga in the Tang sect apart from Hua Yuhao, who was special. However, Wang Donga was still 1 level lower than Long Aotian in terms of cultivation. Hua Yuhao finally understood why the sense of oppression from his opponent had been so strong. Long Aotian's abilities had reached an unprecedented level. 7 rings. He was a soul sage. Long Aotian wasn't the only soul sage in this tournament. There had also been the 3-legged golden toad, Xiao Hongchen. However, everyone from the Tang sect could tell that Xiao Hongchen had gained his seven-ringed cultivation through both medicine and some other special methods. He might even have sacrificed his future improvements as well as overstimulated his current potential in order to have become a soul sage in time for the tournament. This video will end here.